Hello, a very warm good evening to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to our Target Prelims 2022, where our endeavor is to help you be better prepared for the prelims examination scheduled for the next month. Today, we are going to embark upon a journey for environment and ecology. And in the coming 3 classes, including today, we are going to cover important topics of environment and ecology, which have been in relevance for the previous year, and even few of the topics which have been in relevance the year before that, but are important nonetheless for the examination of the prelims examination. So, how is it that we are going to approach this subject of environment and ecology? Overall, we shall be following an approach of dividing this subject into 3 different parts and 3 different subunits. The first part of this environment and ecology, if you look at it, the whole syllabus coverage, the first part can be classified into the static portion. Now here, by static portion, I mean the portion regarding the conceptual areas such as biodiversity, ecological niche, then ecosystems, biomes, and all the habitat features that you generally encounter upon. Now there again, you have various different subclassifications such as the types of ecosystems that you have, the types of wetlands that you have, the various different issues which have remained in news such as grey hydrogen, black hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and so on. So all those areas we are going to cover today. That is the first module. The second module, we shall be devoting it into species. The important species which have been in news for the past complete 1 year. Now these important species, why they are important is because always you will find UPSC does ask a question directly regarding either a species or the protected area where they are housed. So when we are going to cover the species portion, we are going to cover the protected areas concerned as well. So you don't need to memorize and learn all the national parks and wildlife sanctuaries which are out there, but then only the ones which have been in relevance. And the third portion shall be about conventions and laws. So for example, we had the COP26 held at Glasgow, and also various different types of conventions that we have such as Aichi, Nagoya, and so on. All of that we shall be covering in the third module or in the third session. So all these 3 shall form a kind of a bulwark for your preparation and shall help you remain on the front lines of your preparation. So that is why we are going to take this approach, and today we are going to delve into the area regarding ecosystems, habitats, biomes, pollution, and so on. So all these different topics we shall be covering today. We are going to take up various different questions, and through those questions we shall also be attacking the different types of concepts which are there. Overall, this endeavor of Target Prelims 2022, I hope that you are following it regularly. We have already conducted the sessions for various different subjects, and we shall be continuing to do so for the next 10-12 days. If you like this endeavor, please like, share, and subscribe the video, and also click upon the bell icon to receive the notification when the next video is going to start. Having said that, without further ado, let us start upon with the discussion of the questions, starting with the first question of the day. And that question is, consider the following statements with reference to the Ramsar Sites in India. Now, Ramsar Sites are always going to be important for your examination. Why? Because Ramsar Sites, what are Ramsar Sites? So basically, we had a Ramsar Convention which was signed way back in 1971 in Iran, whereby it was decided to give or extend a kind of protection to aquatic and wetland ecosystem. By aquatic ecosystem here, I do not mean the marine ecosystem, only the bogs, swamps and the wetlands that we look upon and that we are concerned with in our day-to-day lives. Now these wetlands that we see around us, they are very, very important environmentally and ecologically speaking. Why is that so? That is because wetlands, they typically serve as sinks for storage of carbon which is released into the atmosphere. So thereby, they can also help in mitigate the various different issues of greenhouse gases polluting the environment and also the climate change issue that we are facing. Every year, new sites are included into this Ramsar Convention and protection is extended to newer areas and newer sites as well. So, for the purpose of examination, it is very, very important for all of you to have a clear-cut understanding regarding which are the sites which have been added this particular year and also in the preceding year, because chances are you might get an indirect question regarding those particular sites, maybe about their location, maybe about the species that specialize in that area, and so on and so forth. So, if you take a look at the options here, then Khijadia Wildlife Sanctuary near the Gulf of Kutch has both saltwater and freshwater marshlands. Now, Khijadia Wildlife Sanctuary is one of those areas or wetlands which have been included into the Ramsar Site Convention this particular year. So that is why this Khijadia Wildlife Sanctuary is going to be important. So, is this true that it does include both saltwater as well as freshwater marshlands? It is absolutely true. It is actually situated in the region of Run of Kutch, and there it is a large water body. Mind you, it is an inland sort of water body where in the inland portion you have fresh water coming from the localized rivers, and towards the coastline you have the saline water due to excessive amount of evaporation. As the movement of water stops, thereby the rate of evaporation significantly increases. As the rate of evaporation in any water body shall be significantly higher, that would mean a kind of an increased salinity in that water body. So Khijadia is actually one of those. So the first statement is correct. And this is one of those which has been added this year. Okay, next, Bakhira Wildlife Sanctuary, a coastal wetland, is an important ground for water birds that migrate on the Central Asian flyway. Now, just like Khijadia, Bakhira Wildlife Sanctuary is also one of those wetlands which have been added this year. Now, where is it situated? It is actually situated in the region of Eastern UP. Where? In Sant Kabir Nagar district. Now, it is the home for important water birds such as saras. Oftentimes, you also have various different birds who migrate on the various different flyways, and they have a stopover on this Bakhira Wildlife Sanctuary. That is why it is a very important area which now is being protected. Now, is it a coastal wetland? Absolutely not. It is situated in eastern UP, so it cannot be a coastal wetland ecosystem. So, the third statement is Bhindwara's Wildlife Sanctuary is a natural saline wetland and hosting endangered Egyptian vulture. So while it is true that Bhindwara's Wildlife Sanctuary does host endangered Egyptian vulture, along with that it does also host bald eagles and various other species of birds, but then it is not natural, it is man-made. Where is it situated? It is situated in Haryana. So that is why this again is going to be incorrect. So out of these three, we have one only which is correct, and the answer shall be D. So from this area, what you can extract basically is that these two are important, they have been added recently, and their location is also something you should be able to recall. Other than this, in the later part of last year, that is 2021, you had another wetland which was added, and that was Hyderpur wetland in Uttar Pradesh. Where was it, or where is it situated? It is situated in the region of Hastinapur Wildlife Sanctuary. So these three are the latest additions that you have. That is Khijadia, Bakhira, as well as Hyderpur wetland. So these three you should be able to recall, and if a question suppose comes to match the wetland with the states where they are located, this will provide you a kind of an ease of solving of the questions as well. Always remember that you can always find a question regarding the importance of wetlands as well, the utility of wetlands as well. So these wetlands or aquatic ecosystems, not only do they store huge amount of carbon, they also act as sponges which helps mitigate flood because they keep on absorbing the excessive water which is present in the river channels nearby, and also they significantly help us in recharging the underground aquifers. So the groundwater level also keeps on rising if the wetland ecosystem is to the point and is maintained quite significantly. Wetland ecosystem, however, is facing increased threats world over. Because immediately you might have this question that who is destroying this? Why do we need to protect these wetlands in the first place? So wetland ecosystems are under increased threat. Why? First of all, because of natural factors as well as anthropogenic factors. Natural factors are, for example, due to increased climate change and global warming, few of the areas are experiencing very high temperatures. So due to that, many of the wetlands are drying up quite significantly. So this is one of the natural factors. The anthropogenic factors are much more devastating and are much more instantaneous in terms of their impact that they have. When we talk about anthropogenic factors, we have various different issues such as reclamation of wetlands for agricultural purposes. In many parts of Southeast Asia, these wetlands are now being put to use for agricultural purposes and growth of crops such as paddy, because paddy also does require some amount of standing water. So for that, and also for the endless construction activities which mankind keeps on pursuing, these wetlands, they form an easy prey. So because of these natural aquifer recharging systems are under increased threat. So you should be aware of the benefits of wetlands, the threats posed to these wetlands, and what this Ramsar Convention is. Other than that, as I told you, what is also important is to be able to recall the wetlands which have been added the previous year. So for 2 years, the wetlands which have been added, that is something you should know. So for 2022, we know about the Khijadia and Bakhira, and we also know Hyderpur, which has been added very late last year. Other than that, in August 2021, we had 4 more wetlands which were added to the Ramsar sites in India. And now in total, we have close to around 49 Ramsar sites or 49 protected areas in our country. So which were those 4 which were added in 2021? You had the Sultanpur National Park, then you had the Bhindwara Wildlife Sanctuary. Mind you, this is actually man-made. Okay? Then you had the Thol Lake Wildlife Sanctuary again in Gujarat and Vadwana Wetland again in Gujarat. So these are the wetlands which have been added the previous year. Now, in the question you also came across the terminology regarding flyway, the Central Asian flyway. So what are flyways? So when we talk about migratory species, migratory birds, they actually travel across thousands of kilometers across the globe in order to escape maybe harsh weather conditions during certain seasons, in order to maybe breed, or in order to gather food during a very difficult climatic condition. So these are the flyways which we talk about when we consider the migratory birds or the migratory species. So in total, you have these 8 flyways which are out there across the globe. You have the Pacific Americas, Central Americas, Atlantic Americas, East Atlantic, Black Sea and the Mediterranean region, East Asia, East Africa, Central Asia, and East Asia, Australasia. The map depicts the various different flyways. You don't need to learn all these flyways, not at all important for your examination. But what is important out of this for your examination is that which are the flyways through which, or the flyways which pass through India. So India lies in the path of which flyways? So basically, you have the Central Asian flyway, East Asian flyway, and the East Asian Australasian flyway. These are the 3 important flyways which does pass through India and Indian territory. So various different migratory species that we talk about, that they come to India or they are endangered or they need to be protected. So whenever we talk about India and protection, and these migratory species will always be in news who use these kinds of flyways and these flyway systems. Okay? So overall, out of this, what is it that you can extract? What is Ramsar Site? What is Ramsar Convention? What are wetlands? The important wetlands added recently, and also the Central Flyway Network. Now, coming to the next question. Consider the following statements with reference to the climate change feedback loop system of the Earth. Now, when we talk about climate change feedback loop, we have 2 kinds of feedback loop which support or in a way mitigate climate change. Accordingly, these loops are referred to as the positive loop, and also we have the negative loop. What are these? So suppose any event or any occurrence out there in the world, it actually helps climate change. It helps in increasing the level of global warming that we are experiencing. Thereby, that kind of activity, that kind of functionality is referred to as the positive loop system. For example, let's talk about, let's say, forest fires. Now, when you have forest fires, more greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere, which further traps heat and also leads to heating up of the ground surface. So it is a positive feedback loop supporting climate change. Then you have the negative loop as well. Negative loop is basically those functionalities, those events and occurrences which in a way mitigate or stops the influence of climate change and global warming. So all those events which bring about a kind of a cooling activity, they can be referred to as the negative loop system. Now, let us take a look at the question. So, the thawing of the permafrost is a part of the positive feedback loop for the Earth's climate system. So this is actually correct. What do we mean by thawing of the permafrost? Means where, and first of all, what do we mean by permafrost? Permafrost refers to a condition or a state where water is present in its frozen form. And it is present in the frozen form throughout the year. Hence the name permanent and frost. So combine them together, you have permafrost. So when you have melting of glaciers, thawing of glaciers, and thereby melting which is observed, let's say in the region around Greenland, Arctic Ocean, etc., all of that does lie in this category. So does that exacerbate the event of climate change or the activity of climate change? Absolutely yes. So it will come in the positive feedback loop. This is correct. How does it help in climate change? That is something we will look into. Desertification is a part of negative feedback loop of the Earth's climate system. Desertification, what is the definition or what is the meaning of desertification? A simple literal meaning of the word can be the expansion of the desertified areas of the globe is referred to as desertification. So, expansion of desertified or deserts across the globe means what? even those areas which naturally would have supported vegetation and trees, now even those areas are turning into deserts. Means what? You have lesser greenery out there. And when you have lesser greenery out there means what? There will be lesser area or lesser sources which will actually absorb carbon dioxide. So the sink of carbon dioxide will be reducing, which means what? More carbon dioxide out there in the atmosphere, which again refers to what? An increased rate of climate change. So desertification will also form a part of the positive feedback loop. Okay? It is not in the negative. So the second statement is incorrect and the answer is going to be A, that is 1 only. Now, we have to and we should understand why is it that melting and thawing of permafrost will lead to or will further exaggerate climate change. Ideally, when you think about melting of ice, nobody thinks of it in the sense that it will lead to an increased warming. Why and how does it lead to an increased warming? That happens because of a property that we refer to as albedo. What is albedo? Albedo is basically any surface's ability to reflect the solar energy received on it. So, when solar energy falls on any surface, some part of that solar energy is absorbed and the rest of it is reflected depending upon the property of the surface. For example, if you consider this area, here you have water body, and you also have ice which is floating. Now suppose solar energy is received in both these areas. Which part of this do you think will absorb more? Out of these two, the ice will actually end up reflecting almost all of the solar energy, whereas water will start absorbing significant amount of solar energy and will reflect little amount. Means what? Water will absorb more solar energy as compared to ice. Now, water being able to absorb more solar energy means again that it will end up exhibiting a rise in temperature because it is absorbing energy. So, it will indicate a rise in temperature. So, wherever water is exposed, in all those areas, more solar energy shall be absorbed and there shall be a subsequent rise in temperature in all these areas. And what does that signify? Or what does that lead to? So, overall, the temperature of this whole region will start increasing. And as the temperature of this whole region starts increasing, further accelerated melting will take place. So that is why melting of the ice regions or the permafrost regions can further accelerate the rate of melting in the nearby and the vicinity areas. This is one of the reasons why Arctic is actually melting at the fastest rate across the globe. Because in the case of Arctic, what do we have underneath those thick ice sheets? We have water body. So even if a part of Arctic melts and some part of that water body is exposed, immediately that becomes an area which will absorb much more amount of solar energy and thereby will end up indicating a significant rise in temperature. So that is why this is a positive feedback loop when it comes to inducing climate change. But other than that, overall if you consider, you have 4 different factors which provide a kind of a feedback loop system, a positive or a negative feedback loop system. So, overall if you think about it, one of this is the cloud cover that you have. Now clouds, do they have a kind of an impact in the sense of positive feedback loop or negative feedback loop? So clouds in the long run, they end up indicating a negative feedback loop. Generally. How? Because when clouds are present above the atmosphere or in the upper reaches of the troposphere, these clouds end up reflecting the solar energy from their top surface itself, and the solar energy is unable to reach the ground surface. So if you think about it, let us consider the total amount of solar energy received on the top of atmosphere to be around 100 units. If you have a very thick cloud cover, these clouds can end up reflecting around 27 units out of those 100 units which are received by the atmosphere. So that tells you that if you have a denser cloud cover, a thicker cloud cover, it can reduce the rise in temperature, and thereby it can provide a negative feedback loop. Similarly, when we talk about precipitation, precipitation again can function as a source of negative feedback loop. Why? Because if you have more precipitation means what? You will have more forested areas. More forested areas means what? Forests are basically sinks of carbon dioxide. They absorb carbon dioxide. So any area which receives more precipitation eventually or subsequently will actually experience more growth of plants taking place in that region. And that is why you will observe that you have these plants being able to absorb more carbon dioxide in the long run. So those areas, they serve to be a negative feedback loop system in the event of climate change. And then we have already talked about ice albedo. Ice, if it is present, it will reflect majority of the sunlight. It will serve as a negative feedback loop. But as this ice starts melting or as there is thawing of glaciers, very soon it can turn into a positive feedback loop system. Okay? So overall, you should be aware of these positive and negative feedback loop systems and how they can impact the environment and also the climate around us. Now, coming to the next question. Consider the following statements with reference to atmospheric aerosols. Now, what are aerosols? Aerosols are actually very small, minute particles consisting of liquid and liquid droplets in a very minute quantity. Sometimes even a solid is suspended there, and they are so light enough and so small enough that they can be suspended into the atmosphere. These aerosols overall, because they are majorly constituted of liquid, they end up reflecting sunlight and scattering the solar energy the moment the solar energy hits them. So that is why it can again be considered as a part of negative feedback loop system in general. However, there are exceptions. As we look into the options here, we will come to know about the exceptions as well. So these are minute solid and liquid particles suspended in the atmosphere. This part is correct. Then, all forms of aerosols create a cooling effect on the atmosphere. All forms of aerosols. This is actually incorrect. Why is it incorrect? Because we have few of the aerosols which also include some solid particles. One of them is black carbon. Now, this black carbon is actually released into the atmosphere as a result of vehicular emissions, as a result of incomplete burning of biomass as well. Now, this black carbon, which is also sometimes referred to as soot, this goes on and settles down on the surface. It actually does circulate in the atmosphere for a long period of time because it is so very light. Not only does this have a very significant impact on the human health, but at the same time, imagine if this black carbon does settle down on the ice portions or on the frozen areas, for example, the Himalayas, thereby these portions shall become the centers which shall be absorbing more and more solar energy. And that will lead to a significant rise in temperature, and that shall lead to melting process. So, black carbon does not lead to a cooling effect, but rather it brings about a heating effect. Okay? This brings about a heating effect. And its impact is already being felt in the region of Himalayas, and it is said that a further accelerated rate of melting in the Himalayas is being observed because of this black carbon getting deposited on the glaciers, on the peaks, and thereby a further rate of melting. So the second statement is incorrect. Then third statement is aerosols aid in the formation of polar stratospheric clouds. What are these polar stratospheric clouds? So these are basically the clouds which are present in the upper atmosphere, especially around the polar regions. Now here you have aerosols which are emitted across the globe, which tend to accumulate in the polar region, and thereby they initiate a kind of a chemical reaction where, let's say, the chlorine and the fluorine atoms and molecules, they end up reacting with the ozone layer, and that is what leads to the depletion of the ozone layer, which leads to a significant thinning of the ozone layer, and that is what we refer to as the ozone hole in our common and day-to-day parlance. So that is what is a polar stratospheric cloud. And aerosols, do they help in formation of polar stratospheric clouds? Absolutely yes. Because these aerosols, they are also released sometimes from fire extinguishers and some coolants as well, certain sprays that you have, all of them, they do release these aerosols. Some of them, they do include the chlorine and the fluorine molecules. They rise up into the atmosphere. They stay there for a very long time. During the winters, they do accumulate in the region around the poles, and that is what leads to the depletion of the ozone layer or the creation of an ozone hole. So 1 and 3 are actually correct in this, and the second one is incorrect. Okay? Now, coming to the next question. With reference to niche, consider the following statements. So what is a niche? Niche, in general everyday English parlance, you might be using niche even in your normal language usage. Niche basically ends up representing an area of specialization, an area which you are comfortable in. So when we talk about environment and ecology, niche refers to those areas where a species belongs to, right? Where the conditions, the atmospheric, the physical conditions are suitable for that particular species. For example, if you take the case of koala bear, for example, koala bears are those who feed on bamboo shoots and bamboo leaves. So that is their niche. That is their area where they are comfortable in. Okay? So a species niche is all of the environmental factor and interspecies relationship that influence this species. Meaning what? The food chain should be ideal, the conditions should be ideal, the vegetation should be ideal, the amount of precipitation or moisture content should be ideal, the soil conditions should support those species. So this statement is correct. Second, species that have narrow or limited niches are considered to be specialist species. So where they cannot accommodate themselves or adjust themselves in a variety of different conditions, they are specialist species. Example can be cited of a koala bear, right? They will feed on those bamboo leaves and bamboo shoots endlessly, but it is not as if they have an appetite for all kinds of shoots and all kinds of leaves out there. So that is why they are a specialist species. So this is again correct. Now, the third one. No two species can have the exact same niche. This is again correct. Why is this correct? Imagine if there are two different species which require the same condition, the same physical conditionality, the environmental conditionality, then there shall be competition amongst them. And thereby you will have always the survival of the fittest. So all the different species have slightly varying kind of niches where they can thrive, right? Even if, let's say, the climatic conditions are same, maybe some requires a condition of the soil, some requires a condition in the trees, in the leaves. So thereby, no two will have the same required condition for their prosperity and for their growth. So 1, 2 and 3 are correct. Fourth is, knowledge of niches can help to conserve endangered species. This is again correct. Why? Because if you are aware of the requirement of any particular animal, any particular species for that matter, you will be much more comfortable in creating those conditions so that those species can survive there. For example, take the case of the cheetah reintroduction program that India is pursuing for the past few years now. Now, what we are doing is, we know the niche conditions where cheetahs actually grow, a kind of a scrubland or semi-arid conditions. So thereby, that is why we are scouting the regions of Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, and the wildlife sanctuaries in those areas are the ones where protection is being extended and further more stringent protection is being imposed so that cheetah reintroduction can be done in a planned and successful manner. So if you are aware of the niche conditions for various different species, their protection becomes much more easier. So you have 1, 2, 3 and 4, all of them being the correct answer in this. Okay? Now, with reference to the ecotone, consider the following statements. Now, what is an ecotone? So when we talk about ecosystems, ecosystems can be of very different types. You can have a forest ecosystem, you can have a desert ecosystem, you can have an estuarine ecosystem, a mangrove ecosystem, you can have a deciduous ecosystem, tropical evergreen ecosystem, all those different types. Now these ecosystems, they change in their conditionalities. They are different in their conditionalities that are offered in terms of the temperature conditions, the climatic conditions, rainfall conditions, etc. Now, when we talk about a transition from one ecosystem to the other ecosystem, that boundary zone or that zone of transition, that is referred to as an ecotone. For example, here if you will consider, this is one type of ecosystem, then grassland is another kind of ecosystem. The boundary zone that we have, now what do we have generally in the boundary zone between forest and grasslands? You will have trees which are much more further spaced away from each other. It is not as if, even if you go out or venture out, it is not as if you would have experienced very dense forest and suddenly very lush grasses. No. Initially, the forest starts thinning out. The trees start getting scattered. Eventually, the trees become completely absent and then you have the grassland. So this transition zone, that is an ecotone. Okay? Now, a transitional area between forest and grassland is an example of ecotone. This is correct, right? Now, it represents only the physical transition from one ecosystem to another. This is incorrect. Why? Because, first of all, always take this as a clue that whenever you have absolute words being used in the option statement, majority of the times, 90% of the times, those statements are going to be incorrect. This is a very layman's kind of tool and technique in solving the questions by the method of elimination. Whenever you have absolute words like only, always, never, these kinds of words when they are used in the statement, most of the times, 90% of the times they are incorrect. There will be 10% of the times where they can be correct, but most of the times you will have certain exceptions which UPSC or the examiner wants you to notice, and it tests whether the candidate is aware of that exception or not. So always be on the lookout for these sorts of absolute terms. Having said that, now does it represent only the physical transition from one ecosystem to another? The answer is no, because it also ends up representing a transition in the living conditions and the living systems. The living systems also end up changing. The type of, let's say, the species, the biodiversity that you will find in the forested area, you won't find the same species to be thriving in the ecotone. Right? The type of species that you find to be thriving in the grassland area, those same species you won't find to be in existence in the ecotone. So that is why even the living species, the living conditions, all of that undergoes a kind of a change. So the second statement is incorrect. Third, ecotones are harsh conditions for interior organisms but zones of opportunity for edge organisms. What does this mean? So basically, when we talk about any ecosystem such as forested ecosystem, now that forest will include both the dense or the interior part of the forest as well as the outskirts or the fringes of the forest. Certain species will specialize to be living in only the denser part or the interior part, and they are referred to as the interior organisms. But there are certain species which can thrive even in the fringes of those forests, and those are referred to as the edge organisms. So when we talk about ecotones, for example, when we consider, let's say, a terrestrial ecosystem and an aquatic ecosystem, the ecotone will be what? The coastal area. So the edge species will always have more opportunity to breed, to feed themselves, and to thrive in population in those transitional areas, because they will get a huge source of supply of various food and also various physical conditions. So this is actually correct. While it will be very harsh and very difficult for the interior organisms to be thriving in the ecotone, but for edge organisms, it is very good. So 1 and 3 are correct, and we had to find out which of them is or are incorrect. So in this, the answer shall be B, that is 2 only. Please also keep a note of whether it is being asked about pointing out correct or incorrect, because here as well, always you will find candidates committing mistakes, very silly mistakes, which is completely avoidable. So please try to avoid these kinds of mistakes. Now, which of the following are examples of biome? Now, biomes, what are biomes? So biomes are again physical and environmental conditions where a species does thrive, and you have a certain defined set of climatic as well as the physical conditions which are present there. So you can have broader classification of 2 types of biomes. You can have either terrestrial biomes or you can have aquatic biomes. Aquatic biomes will include various different areas such as kelp forest, coral reefs, etc. And when we talk about terrestrial biomes, it can have, let's say, a biome regarding tropical rainforest, that will form a biome, grassland will form a biome, then desert areas will form a biome, mountainous areas will form a biome. So all these different physical conditionalities, they form a kind of a biome. Now, estuaries, mangroves, grassland and desert. Out of these 4, estuaries and mangroves, they do not represent biomes. They represent ecosystems. Now, when we talk about aquatic ecosystem, these estuaries and mangroves which are present in the coastlines, you won't find them to be included in the aquatic biome. So this is not a part of terrestrial biome either. These are various different ecotone areas, or also sometimes you can consider them to be individual ecosystems. Grassland and desert, on the other hand, they represent a unique conditionality with their own fringe area, with their own boundary region and their own interior area, where certain species which are very habituated to these areas can only thrive. So grassland and desert will be the example of biome, whereas estuaries and mangroves are not. So the answer in this case will be A, that is 3 and 4 only. The other way to solve this is if you are aware that estuary is an ecosystem and not a biome, just simply end up eliminating one wherever possible. And then eventually, if you see that desert is present, that means 4 has to be correct. You are left with only one kind of option. This process of elimination you have to practice. There is no two ways about it, because chances are in the prelims examination, this can mean the difference between you attempting this exam for another year or you getting through and appearing for the mains examination. So always try to maximize your number of attempts with the help of this process of elimination. Okay? Now, coming to the next question. Consider the following statements with reference to tropical evergreen vegetation in India. Now, every year you also find a question coming from the region of forests. So, nowadays, because the green spaces across the globe, they have come under increased attention, increased span of attention. That is why every year you do find a question coming from forest. When you read about these forests, what is it that you should be reading about? Or what are the various things you should be concentrating upon? So when you read about any forest, there are 3 things that you should be concentrating upon. First is the conditions required. In the case of forest, when we talk about conditions required, generally we are talking about the amount of rainfall which is required for that forest to exist in that region. Then, other than that, the areas in India where you can find these kinds of forests, and this you can always deduce logically. If you are aware of the rainfall distribution of the country, you can deduce the types of forest which can be found in the region. And other than that, you also need few examples of species. UPSC has asked this question, these types of questions earlier. UPSC can again ask these types of questions. So that is something you should be very clear about. Now, consider the following statements with reference to tropical evergreen vegetation. Now, when we talk about tropical evergreen vegetation, what is the rainfall requirement? In general, the amount of rainfall has to be greater than 220 centimeter. 200 to 220 centimeter. Above that, if you have the annual amount of rainfall received in that area, typically you will end up finding a tropical evergreen forest. Now, which are the regions in our country where you find these tropical evergreen forests? The rainiest parts in the country. The regions which receive the maximum amount of rainfall. And which regions are those? So, you have western part of Western Ghats. Then other than that, you have the northeastern region and also the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So in these areas, you do find tropical evergreen forests in existence. Now, these are the most widespread forests in India. Incorrect. These forests are found only in these 3 parts, not across the whole Western Ghats even, only in the western part of the Western Ghats and some parts of the northeastern states and Andaman Nicobar Islands. So they can never be the most widespread forest found in the country. So we know that one is incorrect. So, which is the most widespread forest across the country? It is actually tropical deciduous. Tropical deciduous forests, they require a conditionality of rainfall varying between 70 centimeter almost up till 190 to 200 centimeter. This much amount of rainfall is the wide range required for the growth of these deciduous forests. You can have dry deciduous forest if the rainfall is low. You can have wet deciduous forest if the amount of rainfall is higher. So these deciduous forests are the most widespread. Now, the tropical evergreen forests are mostly multi-layered with short and softwood trees. This is again going to be incorrect. Why? Because here you have the forests having the length of the trees, the height of the trees to be quite significant. And in fact, their height is so high that on the forest floor, many of the times sunlight is not even received because of the canopy cover of the trees blocking the sunlight. So because the sunlight is not received on the forest floor, you don't have undergrowth, and that is why you don't have layering of trees in this forest. So both 1 and 2 are incorrect. Then shisham and mahua are the dominant species of this forest. Again, this being incorrect. Why? Because here these both are the examples of tropical moist deciduous or tropical wet deciduous. So this is again going to be incorrect. All these three are going to be incorrect. So that is why we have to find out which of them are incorrect. So that is why the answer is going to be D. Now, why is this question in relevance, or why is this question going to be important other than the fact that UPSC does ask about it every year? Because of the India State of Forest report which has been released recently. While we will be talking about this forest report in greater detail in the coming sessions, but right now this is just about the forest and their conditions. This is a map representing the forest cover and the various different types of forests that you have, and you will find these evergreen forests to be restricted in certain parts here, here and here. That's it. And across the rest of the country, you find a significant amount of tropical deciduous forests to come into existence. Now, then we have a question regarding food chain. So again, for the past couple of years, UPSC has been asking a question regarding food chain. So which of the following is or are the correct sequence of a food chain? So first is butterfly, dragonfly and frog. So this is actually a correct sequence, right? So dragonfly feeds upon butterfly and frogs feed upon dragonflies. This ends up representing, or this is basically observed where? In the marshy ecosystem. In the marshes and the swamps that you have. This is a kind of the food chain that you do observe. So this is correct. Then you have zooplankton, squid and crustaceans. This is incorrect. Why? Zooplanktons, being very small, are first ingested or first are consumed by small crustaceans and mollusks that you have. So crustaceans, they consume the zooplanktons, and then these crustaceans are then consumed by larger fishes, which in turn is consumed by squids. Squids become a kind of an apex consumer or apex predator in this aquatic ecosystem. So generally you will find in these food chains the squids to be at the end. Many of the times squids can directly consume crustaceans as well. Okay? So here the perfect or the right arrangement shall be zooplankton followed by crustacean, then followed by squid. Then and this is something which will be observed where? In aquatic ecosystems. Then you have beetle, aphid and bird. Here again, what are aphids? Aphids are basically very small sap-sucking insects which you find on the leaves. And these aphids are then consumed by beetle. So here, this shall be or this should be the correct statement or the correct arrangement. Aphids are consumed by the beetle and then birds, they feed upon these beetle. So the third statement is also, or the third portion is also arranged incorrectly. So the correct food chain pattern shall be observed in one only, and that will form the answer. This generally you will find it to be in existence in agro ecosystems. That is where you will find them to be in existence, you will find them at play in those ecosystems. Okay? So food chain, you cannot be expected to have a kind of a memorization of each and every food chain that is out there. That there are simply huge numbers of food chain, and nobody can expect to remember and recall all those. Broadly, you should be aware that there are two types of food chain. One is the grazing food chain and the other is the detritus food chain. Now, in the case of the grazing food chain that we have, this is a normal food chain that you would have read about, that you would have experienced, where the herbivores, they eat the grass, then the carnivores, they eat the herbivores, and so on. When we talk about detritus food chain, we are actually talking about and we are concerned about the decomposers. Right? So, the dead animal and plants. So, initially you have microorganisms which feed on the dead matter, and thereby those microorganisms, they are then consumed by smaller insects. Those smaller insects are then consumed by slightly larger animals or carnivores, for example, maggots. Then they are then consumed by other species. So that forms a kind of a detritus food chain, or those of decomposition. Okay? So these are the broader kinds of food chain networks that we have. Then, with reference to the biogeochemical cycles, consider the following statements. Now, what do we mean by biogeochemical cycles? So again, broadly, we have two types of biogeochemical cycles. We have one that is the gaseous cycle, where the elements or the different agents, they are actually replenished on the surface as well as in the atmosphere in the gaseous state. And then we have the sedimentary cycle, where the various different elements, they are circulated in the atmosphere and also on the surface, basically through the sedimentary flow, being absorbed in the soil particles, then being circulated as runoff into the water body, then being circulated into the atmosphere as a result of the various aerosols being sprayed in the coastal area, and so on. So when we talk about, let's say, the carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, water cycle, all these are basically the cases of gaseous biogeochemical cycle. But when we consider phosphorus, sulfur, rock cycle, all these, here the circulation or their replenishment is actually observed through the soil particles, through the water bodies which are present around. Example of a nitrogen cycle is, as you can see here, the atmosphere is at play, right? And that is how replenishment does take place. So this is a typical case of a nitrogen cycle, where nitrogen fixation is carried on with the help of lightning, with the help of nitrogen fixing bacteria, and then eventually denitrifying bacteria, they return the nitrogen molecules back into the atmosphere. So these are biogeochemical cycles. Now, in the biogeochemical cycle, transfer of materials and energy amongst the biotic and abiotic pools is dominated by microorganisms. This is true. Microorganisms play a very significant role in accelerating as well as decelerating these biogeochemical cycles. So the first statement is true. Then, gaseous cycles tend to be more rapid than the sedimentary cycles which are observed. This is again true, because it takes or it consumes a much larger amount or proportion of time when we consider the sedimentary cycles. For those same elements to be replenished, the time taken will be significantly higher. Whereas for gaseous cycles, comparatively, it will be a shorter span of time. So in this, both 1 and 2 are going to be correct. Ideally, you should be aware about the basics of water cycle, nitrogen cycle, etc. These are the important ones that you should be aware of, which you would have read under the nitrogen cycle, you would have already read under environment, water cycle, etc. you would have read under geography anyways. Now, which of the following are responsible for nitrogen fixation on the earth? So again, this is a part of the nitrogen cycle. Here, why nitrogen fixation becomes important is you have to understand that nitrogen is one of the major nutrients which is required by the plants for their accelerated growth. Now, majority of the soil types across the globe, they are lacking in nitrogen content. That is why amongst all the fertilizers that we add in order to aid agriculture and in order to aid agricultural productivity, nitrogen fertilizer in the form of urea is the one which you will find to be most dominant. Now, that is why we have to study more about nitrogen fixation. Why is it that majority of the soil types are poor in nitrogen? That is because the elemental nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere, this elemental nitrogen is slightly inert in characteristic. It does not react readily. It does not readily fix itself to the soil. And that is why even the rock types that you have, they will be very poor in nitrates. And hence the soil which is derived will also be poor in nitrogen content. And that is why urea is consumed by the agricultural sector in such increased quantity. So, nitrogen fixation is carried out by various different agents. So, first is blue-green algae. Does it help in nitrogen fixation? Absolutely yes. Second is Achromobacter. Does this help in nitrogen fixation? No, this does not. Why? Because it is a denitrifying bacteria. So, it basically is in this category. Achromobacter helps convert the nitrates into elemental nitrogen. So, this is a denitrifying bacteria which converts nitrates and nitrites into elemental nitrogen. So, the second is going to be incorrect. Now, whenever you have these 5 to 6 listed out there, always start solving by the process of elimination. You know that second is incorrect. Wherever 2 is present, eliminate that statement, eliminate that option. Automatically, without looking at the other 3, you have already reached the correct answer. So, in this case again, you have lightning. The action of lightning is a significant or does have a significant role to play in nitrogen fixation. So, this will be correct, and rhizobium is also a nitrifying bacteria which helps in nitrogen fixation. So, 1, 3 and 4 are correct and 2 and 5 are incorrect. So, these are the activities which help in accelerate or promote the activity or the event of nitrogen fixation in the soil. Then, coming over to eutrophication. Now, eutrophication is a serious water pollution problem leading to formation of dead zones. So, what is this eutrophication? When we talk about eutrophication, basically, here you have excessive amount of nutrients which are forced into an aquatic system like a lake or a pond, and thereby in those ecosystems, because of these excess nutrients, you have a sudden growth of blue-green algae. Now, many of the times you would have seen the ponds to have a kind of a greenish appearance, even reddish appearance sometimes, which forms the very famed red tides as is observed in the region of Florida in United States. Now, that color of blue or bluish green or red is imparted by the algal species which suddenly thrive in numbers. Now these algal species, they form a kind of a film and a thin layer on the surface which blocks the sunlight from coming in the lower regions. Now, eventually these algal species will die. As they start dying, the decomposing bacterium, they work upon these algae and they consume all the dissolved oxygen which is present in the water around. Thereby, it drains that water of any kind of dissolved oxygen which is present there. And various different plant species and fishes, they actually survive based upon that dissolved oxygen. If that dissolved oxygen is extracted out of it, then that is when the fishes, they start dying in sudden large numbers. Why is it that eutrophication does happen or does take place? So whenever you have, let's say, the various different fertilizers, herbicides, etc., rich in these compounds, when they are drained out from the agricultural field to the nearby lake, that can lead to eutrophication. Industrial pollutants, that can lead to eutrophication. All these processes, they lead to a decline in aquatic ecosystems' health and also the population of the species living in aquatic ecosystem, thereby creating a kind of an ecosystem which is devoid of oxygen. And that is why suddenly one morning when you wake up, you observe that large pools of dead fishes, they flood or they swarm any kind of lake. So that is the process of eutrophication. Now, which of the following are remedial measures to tackle eutrophication? That is, how can eutrophication be tackled? So biomanipulation. Biomanipulation is what? Whereby you treat these algal blooms which happen or the sudden growth which take place with the help of certain microbes which they consume them and which removes them. That is biomanipulation. So yes, this is a remedial measure. Then aeration. Aeration will do what? It will provide oxygen, right? And this oxygen is going to be very, very important for the growth of these species, for the survival of the fishes in the first place. So yes, it can also help in removal or giving a kind of a remedy to the process of eutrophication. Now, when we talk about 1 and 2 being correct, look at all the options which are present here. There is only one option out there which satisfies the condition of 1 and 2 both being correct, and that is option B, right? So without looking at statement 3 and 4, automatically you have reached your solution. Okay, but anyways, when we talk about internal loading, what is the meaning of internal loading? So internal loading is when you enrich any such system with increased mineral quantity and more minerals. That is what is internal loading. But here, in the case of aquatic ecosystem, already the process of eutrophication takes place because of increased and excessive nutrients which are flowing there. So that is why internal loading can never lead to a remedy for eutrophication. It can only exaggerate the problem. So this will be not a remedial measure. And creating anoxic zones. What are anoxic zones? Those zones which are going to be devoid of oxygen. Now, in the case of eutrophication, we need to be providing more oxygen rather than making the system to be devoid of oxygen cover. So this again is going to be incorrect, right? So you have 1 and 2 being correct, and these can be the remedial measures to tackle the problem of eutrophication. Eutrophication is again another one of those issues which is important for your environment part and especially the static portion, okay? And eutrophication is again one of those things which is actually hampering the wetland ecosystem and which is posing as a threat to the wetland ecosystem in our country, okay? Now, which of the following are the reasons or factors for exposure to mercury pollution? Mercury or elemental mercury, that being released into the atmosphere, that being received on the ground surface in the form of precipitation or rain, all of that can lead to significant diseases and a damage to the ecosystem. When you have this mercury being present in the water body, that can lead to mass death of the fishes and all those aquatic animals living there. Even a slightest proportion of mercury can significantly lead to a large scale destruction of the ecosystem when we talk about aquatic ecosystems in particular. Now, how is it that mercury is released out there, or which of these do pose a threat in terms of the exposure to mercury? So, when we talk about thermal power plants, yes, their emissions, they lead to mercury poisoning. Waste incinerators in hospitals, they do generate various different chemicals, and that is why the incinerators, they can also be a source for mercury pollution. Volcanic eruption is one of the natural sources of mercury pollution. Now, then other than that, biomass burning, that can again lead to mercury pollution, and blood pressure instruments. Even in blood pressure instruments, so the thermometers that we have, you have the mercury column there, right? So there again, you can have exposure to mercury provided that it is not used safely. If it is used safely, then you don't have any threat of mercury exposure. So all these, they can basically lead to a significant amount of mercury pollution or exposure that can happen. And here if you consider, then observe, even through volcanic eruptions, through thermal power plants, through the mining processes, all these three processes, or multiple processes for that matter, that releases mercury into the atmosphere in very small quantities. And that mercury, it combines with the greenhouse gases out there and forms what we refer to as methyl mercury, which is then absorbed, and that methyl mercury is then consumed by very small krill, which is then consumed by larger fishes, even bigger fishes, and that is how the process of biomagnification, as we refer to it, that takes place. And when these fishes are consumed by us humans, we also suffer from diseases, right? So, for mercury poisoning, you had the very famous Minamata Convention, which was held in Japan. And that convention dealt with mercury poisoning in aquatic ecosystem. And that is the name, the Minamata region is actually very infamous for the fact that you had large scale mercury poisoning amongst humans because of consumption of these fishes, which in turn were polluted by mercury due to consumption of smaller fishes. So that is why from mercury poisoning you also have the very infamous Minamata disease. Okay? Now, here from that we come to the question regarding diseases. Consider the following pairs where you have a kind of a disease and the causing substance which can lead to that disease occurring. So black lung disease. Black lung disease is also what was for a long time referred to as coal miners disease. So this actually is generated, or this actually happens because of the coal mines, the coal dust, very small particles of coal dust that are present in these mines. When the miners, they keep on working incessantly, thereby they are liable to inhale that coal dust. That coal dust, that starts burning the tissues in the lungs, and that is what brings about a kind of a respiratory problem, right? So that is a black lung disease. So this is correctly matched. Then you have blue baby syndrome. Is it because of mercury poisoning? No. Because of mercury poisoning, you have the Minamata disease. Now, blue baby syndrome is basically when in the infant or in the young ones, the body starts turning blue. And why does it start turning blue? Because of lack of oxygen. So that is when the body doesn't get enough oxygen supply, and as a result of that, the muscle mass, etc., starts withering quite rapidly. Now, why does this blue baby syndrome occur? That happens because of nitrates, nitrate pollution. That is why you have the blue baby syndrome happening. Now I know that 2 is incorrect. Wherever 2 is present, I will mark that out. And I know that 1 is correct, by the way. So I will eliminate B as well, because B talks about 3 only. So automatically I have arrived, or I have reached the correct answer. While it may seem reiterative to you, but do practice this. This will help you. Then we have the Blackfoot disease. This is because of arsenic poisoning, and this is correct. This was actually observed in large quantities in Southeast Asian region, especially in the region around Vietnam. However, nowadays, arsenic poisoning is also being absorbed or observed across the vast northern Indo-Gangetic plains. Why? Because the water level is depleting quite significantly, and that is when arsenic is also coming out along with the groundwater. And that is where you also are going to observe Blackfoot disease to be in increased prominence in the coming years. Then we have Itai, which is again due to cadmium poisoning. Here what happens is basically the bones and their joints, they become so stiff. That is when you have a kind of osteoporosis as a disease which does affect you or does influence you. So that is the Itai because of again cadmium poisoning. This again was something which was observed in Japan first, and Itai is taken from there itself. So 1, 3 and 4 are the ones which are correctly matched. Ideally, you should be aware of even the Minamata disease and all these 4 to 5 diseases which are out there, and the pollutants which cause them. Now, consider the following statements with reference to ocean acidification. Now, when we talk about ocean acidification, what is it that we are talking about basically? Ocean acidification is something you would have heard about multiple times now. So, when we talk about oceans being or turning acidic, that means you have an excessive presence of hydrogen ions present in the ocean. Now, this hydrogen ions, as they increase in quantity, the pH value of these oceans, they start decreasing. Since the time of Industrial Revolution, the pH value in these oceans have reduced by 0.1. The pH value has reduced by this much. While it may seem to be very less, but then this pH value being logarithmic, this basically ends up referring to a kind of 30 times more acidification as compared to the pre-industrial era. So that is quite a significant quantity in terms of the oceans turning acidic, right? That is why it is an increased cause of worry. Now, marine calcifying organisms are negatively affected by ocean acidification. Calcifying organisms means what? Those organisms which have a kind of a shell-like structure around them. Those are referred to as the calcifying organisms. The crustaceans that you have, the mollusks, all these kinds of species, the crabs, these are calcifying organisms. Now, how is it that they construct a shell around themselves? By synthesizing the carbonate ions which are present in the water. But then, as the oceans keep on turning acidic, thereby the carbonate ions are consumed and the hydrogen mixes to actually make up the very weak bicarbonate ions. So the carbonate ions, they keep on reducing in quantity, as a result of which these calcifying organisms, they are unable to build their shell no longer, and that is why they are threatened. So this is correct, they are negatively impacted. Second, it increases the efficiency of sonar communication. Sonar communication means the sound waves are able to, or we are able to transmit the sound waves in a much more efficient manner. So is this correct? Yes. Because again, when we talk about the sound waves traveling in aquatic or marine ecosystems, you have the borate ions. Now these borate ions, what they do is they tend to absorb sound. Right? But due to ocean acidification, even these borate ions, they are basically consumed and the hydrogen combines with them, because please understand, with increased acidification means what? The amount of hydrogen ions present is increasing, and hydrogen ions, they combine readily with borate ions, and that is when the borate ions are also depleting, and sound which is emitted maybe by the whales, the dolphins, or even the sonar instruments that you have in the ships and submarines, they are turning out to be able to reach to larger distances in a much more efficient manner. So this is again correct. Then increased ocean acidification would help in decelerating global warming. Now, is this correct? Actually, this is incorrect. Why? Because when you have ocean acidification taking place, meaning what? The population of plant species, that is phytoplanktons, these phytoplanktons, their population will significantly reduce. And these phytoplanktons, they form a sink or a kind of an absorbing agent for carbon dioxide out there in the environment. As their population reduces, the amount of carbon dioxide which is absorbed by the oceans, that will keep on reducing. And as a result, it will form a kind of a positive feedback loop rather than a negative feedback loop. So this is incorrect. 1 and 2 are actually correct. If you look at ocean acidification, this is the reaction which takes place where you observe the carbonate ion being consumed and thereby formation of bicarbonate ions which is observed. So the calcifying organisms, they are unable to form the shells around their body, and that is what is severely threatening their existence. Because, and why is this ocean acidification taking place in the first place? Because of increased absorption of carbon dioxide. You have more and more carbon dioxide out in the atmosphere. All that carbon dioxide is absorbed from the atmosphere. Close to around 30% of carbon dioxide emissions across the globe are absorbed by the oceans across the globe. So, with more carbon dioxide actually emitted in the atmosphere, more of them will be absorbed by the oceans and they will react with water and the carbonate ions dissolved in the water, they will form the bicarbonate ions. So the carbonate ions which are required for this shell making process, that is consumed. Similar reaction also ends up consuming the borate ions as well. Okay? So this is ocean acidification. Now, with reference to ecological succession, consider the following statements. Ecological succession refers to what? It basically, in a very layman's term, in a very layman's language, it basically talks about how in any particular kind of land area of water body, how initially you have habitations coming in, the plant vegetation, and different kinds of species which start thriving in, and eventually you have the development of a climax community in the form of large trees such as oak, etc. Right? So, succession, ecological succession is of different types. When we talk about primary succession, primary ecological succession refers to the fact that an area which was very barren and uninhabited before, that area slowly and steadily, look at it, how slowly and steadily you have even the thicker soil cover which comes into existence because of weathering action, biological weathering, etc. And also the types of species which come in, that also starts significantly varying and diversifying itself. This is primary succession. But then, sometimes what happens is that this primary succession or these species which have thrived in a region, maybe they get destroyed due to a volcanic eruption, due to a nuclear disaster, maybe due to a forest fire, and again all the species are removed. Again, slowly and steadily, you will have the build-up of new species, and again you will have the mature species forming the climax community. Now this will be referred to as a secondary succession. Why? Because here in this ecosystem already you have had the existence of various different kinds of biodiversity, and once they were wiped out, again a replenishment process has taken place. Okay? Now, primary succession always begins on a barren surface, whereas secondary succession begins in environments that already possess soil. So, as you can see from the figure as well, primary succession began on the barren surface, and secondary succession, when it began, observe, you already had the existence of soil cover. So, this statement is going to be correct. Hardwood species like oak are example of climax community. This is correct. They will not be, you won't have in any barren area, the first vegetation which comes up, you won't have that to be large trees, oak, rhododendron, etc. No, they will only come in a developed or a later stage. Now, in secondary succession, the pioneer species are plants such as grasses and fireweed. This is again correct. Grasses, they start thriving up in the secondary succession, and that is how their growth takes place. So, you have 1, 2 and 3, all of them being correct, and the correct answer in this case will be D. Okay? Questions can be asked from primary and secondary succession this year as well, because it has been in relevance in the past year, and you had multiple such discussions coming up because of increasing desertification which is happening. The talk of secondary succession has suddenly become very important. In order to reclaim those newly desertified areas, secondary succession is very, very important. So, that is why this is important this particular year. Now, consider the following statements with reference to OECM or other effective area-based conservation measures. Now, these OECM, what are these? So, these are basically areas of protection outside your delineated or demarcated protected areas which are out there. You still have certain other areas which need to be conserved, which need to be effectively managed. So, IUCN, what it has done is, it has started demarcating other areas as OECM in order to exhibit the importance of those areas, the biodiversity which is present in those areas. So, it is a geographically defined area that is achieving effective in situ conservation of biodiversity outside protected areas. In situ refers to what? In situ refers to in that location itself, in that situation itself. So, protection can be of two types. You have in situ and you have ex situ. In situ is, suppose a species is situated here in India. So, you are protecting that species here itself. Ex situ can be what? So, if suppose a species is threatened and I am taking that species to a zoo or a national park or to a different kind of a protected area in order to conserve them, I am transferring that species from its original location, that is ex situ. Okay? So, when we talk about in situ, so that is in that present location, the original location itself. So, OECM is an in situ conservation measure outside the demarcated and delineated protected area. So, this is correct. Second statement, the OECM tag is given by the IUCN. This is again correct, right? Now, again, look at the process of elimination. We know that 1 and 2 are correct and we have to find out which of them are correct. Now, of all the options given here, there is only one option statement which satisfies both 1 and 2 being correct. Regardless of what 3 and 4 are, you know what the correct answer is. But anyways, the tag brings legal, financial and management implication for the state that has an OEM site. This is incorrect. Why is this incorrect? Because it does not bring about these legal or financial or management implication. It identifies an area. It demarcates an area to be of importance and conservation can be carried out. There are no legal provisions which need to be followed for an area once it has been declared as OECM. Okay? So this is incorrect. Whereas the fourth, that is Aravali Biodiversity Park, is India's first OEM site. This is correct. Where is Aravali Biodiversity Park situated? It is situated in the outskirts of Gurgaon. Now this Aravali Biodiversity Park, by the way, in itself, it holds a kind of a beacon or an epitome of our conservation process and our conservation method. Because in that area, if you visit that area at one point of time, you won't be able to believe that at one point of time, this area was actually used for mining purposes, sand mining and quarrying purposes. And it was completely almost barren. Now, after the process of conservation was started, after 5 to 7 years, you had many local species which started coming up and availability of water also started coming up, due to which again it further increased the species diversity and the ecological succession in that area. So that is why Aravali Biodiversity Park in Gurgaon, in the outskirts of Gurgaon rather, that is India's first OEM site. OECM site. So you have 1, 2 and 4 which forms the correct option, and that is why the answer will be D, 1, 2 and 4 only. Okay? Now, consider the following physiological adaptations. Which of the adaptation mechanisms given above are observed in plants or animals living in extremely arid desert biomes? So, those plants first of all who live in the desert areas or who thrive in the desert areas, desert landscape, what are they referred to as? So, ideally they are referred to as xerophytes. Now, the plants and animals over a period of time, they have adapted themselves in order to thrive in these desert landscapes. So, in the desert landscapes, what are the kinds of adaptations needed, or why are the adaptations needed? Water is present in scarce quantity. You will have availability of sandstorms, huge amount of sand and dust blowing along with the wind. So, that is why you need adaptation. So, first of all, long shallow roots. So, when we talk about the plants, observe that they don't have very deep roots. They have shallow but widespread roots in order to access water from wherever needed and wherever necessary. Other than that, they also have fleshy stems. They don't have leaves. Why? Because through leaves, water is lost by the process of evapotranspiration, and that is why leaves are replaced by thorns or spikes. And the stem or the shoot in itself is green in order to carry out the process of photosynthesis or manufacture of food. They are pulpy, right? Why? Because they end up storing water there. So, these are the adaptations made by the plant species. The animal species, they also end up making adaptations. What kind of adaptations? So, they will have thick eyebrows. Why? In order to keep out the sand. They will have closing nostrils. Again, why? In order to keep out the sand. They have a hump. For example, in this case, not all the animals have a hump, but majority of them in order to store excess amount of water and food in certain cases. Then long eyelashes again protect them from those incoming storms, hairy ears, thick fur in order to provide a kind of a protection from extremely cold or low conditions in the desert areas experienced during night time. Now, let's take a look at the statements or the options given here. First, long shallow roots, absolutely yes. Then glossy or waxy leaves or waxy leaves. Why? In order to retain more moisture within them or in order to prevent the loss of water. Thin eyebrows, no. You need thick eyebrows in order to prevent the sand, right? Opening nostrils, no. You need closing nostrils, again, in order to prevent and keep out the sand out there. So you have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 being incorrect, 1 and 2 are correct. Then you have thick fur, that is also present. Why? In order to withstand the very low temperature in desert areas during night time, because deserts, they lose heat at an accelerated pace. So you have 1, 2 and 5 which is correct, 3 and 4 being incorrect. So the answer is going to be A, that is 1, 2 and 5 only. So these are the adaptations. You should be able to understand them rather than being able to simply memorize them. UPSC has asked it earlier as well. Way back in 2018, UPSC had asked this kind of a question. It had specifically asked for the adaptations made by the plants. It can also ask you question regarding the adaptation made by the animals out there. Now, consider the following pairs. Select the correct answer regarding the organisms and the bioindicators that they are. Now, what are bioindicators? So, bioindicators basically, they are that is the functionality whereby, for example, let's consider a large water body. Now, in that large water body, let us assume that you have few of the dissolved metallic compounds which are polluting that water body. Now, with the naked eye, you cannot always end up inferring the type of compounds which are present. You cannot always end up inferring what are the different types of pollutants which are increasing or decreasing in quantities. So, how do we come to an understanding about the purity of an ecosystem? With the help of certain species. Those species are referred to as bioindicators, because they give us an idea. If there is increased pollution, those species will not be found there. And if the water is very clean, then these species will start thriving in number. Just like how a polluted lake will always have algal bloom, right? So that is also a kind of a bioindicator. So when we talk about these, then crustaceans, for example, you have certain crustaceans such as you have the bivalve mollusks. What are the bivalve mollusks? Those which have a shell and two casings which encloses the soft body. These are the bivalve mollusks. Now, they are an indicator regarding metal pollution. So, in any aquatic water body or in any aquatic system, when you have increased metal pollution, you won't find these crustaceans to be present in large quantities. So, this is correct. Phytoplankton, it is again an indicator of water quality, because we have seen earlier as well that with increased ocean acidification, the phytoplankton population starts going down. And that is not a good news for the fishes out there. So that is why this can also be an indicator of the water quality. And then you have mosses. These mosses, they can always give an idea about the heavy metals present in the ponds and lakes, the small aquatic ecosystem which is out there. There you have the presence of these mosses. So all these three are the bioindicators for these kinds of pollution out there. Okay, and we get to know about the kind of pollution depending upon the population of these species. So here 1, 2 and 3, all of them are in fact correctly matched. Now, which of the following are threats to mangrove ecosystem? Mangrove ecosystem, just like wetland ecosystem, is again very important, and UPSC has asked this repeatedly. So, which of the following are the threats to mangrove ecosystem? Rise in sea level. It is a threat to mangrove ecosystem. If the sea level starts and keeps on rising, thereby it will lead to a significant submergence of a larger part. Then shrimp farming. Shrimp farming is actually also a threat. Why and how? So in many of the areas, what and how shrimp farming is done is channels are dug, and these channels, they bring in water from the coastal area into the inland region, so that the shrimps, they also come through those channels. Now this can be done, but what it does actually is, while it can lead to an increased shrimp catch, but at the same time it will lead to a decline or a depletion of water level in the coastal ecosystem, threatening the mangrove ecosystem. Agriculture is one of the biggest threats to mangrove ecosystems across the world. As the coastal communities, they start engaging in more agricultural activities, they are reclaiming more land which were earlier occupied by the mangroves. So all these are a threat. Charcoal and lumber industry. Lumber basically is the wood cutting industry. That is again a threat to the mangrove ecosystem, and so is logging. So all these are basically the induced threat to mangrove ecosystem. Mangrove ecosystem overall, if you consider, they are very, very important. At the same time, they are very, very unique. You find them at the edge of the aquatic as well as the terrestrial ecosystem. So they always can give you an example of an ecotone kind of a condition. Now, part of them is submerged. So that means some part of the root has to be above water in order to exchange oxygen and other gases directly. But at the same time, because they end up growing quite significantly in the coastal regions or saline water, the leaves, they are specialized in a way, or they are adapted in a way where mangroves will have a kind of salt secreting glands. Where? In the leaves. So any leaf that you consider, thereby these leaves, they will have small salt secreting glands. Why? Because the water which is circulated in the system, that water will be saline. Now, through the process of evapotranspiration, as the leaves, they lose water, they will be leaving the salts behind. And these salts will have the potential to jam or block all the pores out there. And that can be a significant damage. So that is why these leaves, they have these salt secreting glands, so that over a period of time, these leaves will have small, very minute particles of salt accumulating on the surface. Maybe a rustling of a wind, maybe a quick shower, all of them can again return that salt back to the ground surface or to the water body. But the tree in itself continues to circulate water and food endlessly. So that is what is special about these mangrove ecosystem. They can actually host a diverse variety of species out there, right? Both aquatic as well as terrestrial species. At the same time, these mangroves, they serve as the filtration process for polluted waters as well. So that is why they are very, very important to our ecosystem. So overall, if you look at the importance of mangroves, so first of all, timber and wood, one of the important ones. Then it gives about water filtration, because they can actually trap within their root systems the heavy impurities, the larger impurities out there. It can support a wide variety of fishes. It also helps in combating the climate change. It also forms a kind of a barrier against natural disasters like tsunamis, like storm surges that you experience during tropical cyclones. So thereby, these mangroves can form a natural line of defense. But they are threatened because of logging activity, agriculture, shrimp farming and other forms of aquaculture, various different kinds of oil pollution, oil spill, etc. Then coastal development, the construction which is taking place, all of them is leading to a significant amount of mangrove loss. Overall, just you have to look at this figure that 35% of mangrove vegetation has been lost, and how quickly? From 1980 to 2000. So within that span of 20-30 years, we have lost a chunk of mangrove forest from around us. And as we talk about and as we speak, as the cyclone is building up across the eastern coastline and as it is approaching the region of Andhra Pradesh, those coastal areas which have those mangrove vegetation, they will be much safer against the impact of floods and other storm surges. So that is why they are very and critically important. Now, consider the following statements with reference to IFAD or International Fund for Agricultural Development recently in the news. So recently, the Madhya Pradesh government came under a collaboration with IFAD in order to promote a kind of the nutrient habit or the nutrient intake in the poorer households. So, what was this IFAD exercise? So, it is first of all, what is IFAD? So, IFAD or International Fund for Agriculture Development is a UN agency or a UN body which was formed way back as a result of the World Food Conference held in the 1970s. Now, this IFAD periodically does study the role of agricultural development and shares know-how with various different countries on how this can be improved, how the agricultural productivity can be increased. And at the same time, it tackles primarily with the nutritional crisis prevalent in the rural areas. It does come out with the Rural Development Report as well periodically. So, it is a specialized agency of the United Nations that releases the Rural Development Report. That is absolutely correct. The second statement, it supports the 7 days, 7 plots program. So, till this portion, it is correct. So, this is the program it has entered with the government of Madhya Pradesh, whereby the 7 days, 7 plots means what? That every day you, or for 7 days, you have 7 different types of vegetables that you grow on your own in your household in order to support your family with more nutrition and more quantity of food and more vegetables, so as to actually eliminate the nutritional crisis engulfing the rural areas across the globe. Now, it supports the 7 days, 7 plots program for teaching women farmers to grow different vegetables in their own garden for commercial purpose. This is incorrect. Why? Because it is done for self-consumption purpose, not for a commercial purpose out there. So, the second statement shall be incorrect. The first statement is correct. But 7 days, 7 plots program is something you have to remember, that it is for increasing the nutritional intake in the rural areas by self-growth of the vegetables in your kitchen garden. So, in this, which are correct, you have A, that is one only, which is going to be the correct answer. Now, consider the following. Which of the following are causes responsible for coral bleaching? Coral bleaching. What is coral bleaching in the first place? So, when we talk about, or when you think about corals, corals basically, when you visualize them, they appear to be a very colored underwater species, right? You will find hues of green, blue, orange, purple, all different types of colors in existence. But then these coral polyps, which are very rich in calcium carbonate, they are actually not having any such color of their own. They are whitish and pale whitish in appearance. It is only the algal species which thrives on them. And which algal species? It is zooxanthellae. The algal species which thrive over them, which provides a different kind of coloration pattern. And these algal species, they live in a symbiotic relationship with the coral polyps, whereby the coral polyps provide these algal species a kind of a platform to grow, to survive. And these algal species in turn, by the process of photosynthesis, they are able to manufacture food, and that food also helps the coral polyps to grow. Now, under certain conditions and due to certain circumstances, these algal species, they start dying off. When they die or when they are removed from those coral reefs, thereby the corals, they are then devoid of any coloration pattern. They are rendered to be whitish and pale whitish in appearance, and that process is referred to as coral bleaching. Now, coral bleaching can take place due to a variety of reasons, due to a wide plethora of reasons. It can happen due to marine pollution. It can happen due to sudden rise in sea level. It can happen due to a decrease in sea level as well. It can also happen due to rising sea temperatures, which is observed across the globe, that the sea level temperatures or the water temperatures across the oceans are rising incessantly, which is posing a threat to the coral species across the globe. So, all of them can lead to coral bleaching. If you actually look into them, then change in ocean temperature, where a rise in sea level temperature can lead to bleaching. Runoff and pollution that we have talked about, that the coastal areas, if they have a lot of pollution, corals, they tend to grow in clear water. They don't thrive in muddy waters. So when you have muddy water which comes into existence due to a runoff from the rivers, the corals won't grow. That is why, if you look at the coastline of the country, you will find almost across the coastline, the areas are suitable for the growth of corals. You will find corals in existence, except the region of Sundarbans. In the region of Sundarbans, you don't find corals. The region where river Mahanadi empties itself, you won't find corals in existence. The region where Godavari empties itself into the Bay of Bengal, you don't find corals. So wherever you have the river mouths, large river mouths, you don't find corals in increased quantity. Why? Because they will bring sediments, they will bring surface runoff, and that will be a muddy condition where the corals won't thrive. Then overexposure to sunlight, that can also lead to a bleaching. Then extreme low tides, where the water level significantly goes down, that can also lead to coral bleaching taking place. So change in ocean temperature, runoff and pollution, overexposure to sunlight, and extreme low tides, all of them can be responsible for coral bleaching, and that is why the answer shall be D, or rather the answer shall be C here. It will be C, 1, 2, 3 and 4. All of them are responsible for coral bleaching taking place. Okay? Now, consider the following statements with reference to Global Fuel Economy Initiative, GFEI. Now, this Global Fuel Economy Initiative is basically formed as a result of a collaboration of various different bodies and organizations coming together. You have the FIA, or Federation International Automobile, then you have the UNEP, then you also have the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies, International Energy Association. All of them, they come together to form a kind of a efficient fuel future for mankind. So that is where you have the Global Fuel Economy Initiative. First, it promotes the introduction of cleaner, energy efficient vehicles in developing countries, so that the efficiency increases, the pollutants decrease, the amount of pollution is very, very low. So this is correct. Then it is a joint effort of the UNEP and the UNFCCC. But here you see that UNFCCC is not there at all. So this is going to be incorrect. It is a joint effort of UNEP, FIA, all these different IEA, then you have University of California, all of them have come together, but UNFCCC is not the convention which has brought in GFEI. GFEI is important as everybody embarks upon greener mobility. So that is why this portion is important for the exam. So here 2 is incorrect, 1 is correct. So that brings us to answer that is A, that is 1 only. Okay? Now, consider the following statements with reference to photochemical smog. Now, what is a photochemical smog? Photochemical smog is basically produced near the ground level when you have the reaction of nitrogen compounds, nitrogen oxides, along with ground level ozone. We know that ozone is present in the ozonosphere beyond troposphere in the region of stratosphere, around 20 kilometers above the ground surface. That ozone which is present in the higher atmosphere, that protects us from ultraviolet rays. But ozone is also produced on the ground level due to increased pollution. And this ground level ozone can be harmful. So nitrogen oxides along with ground level ozone, volatile organic compounds that again is generated due to burning of biomass, due to the paints and varnishes that you have, that also releases certain volatile organic compounds. All of these, they come together under the presence of sunlight. Sunlight is important. Under the presence of sunlight, they react and they produce this kind of hazy, what is referred to as the photochemical smog. It is very, very harmful if it is inhaled. But then the sad problem is this is something which is very prevalent in almost all the developing countries across the globe. So, its common components are ozone, here ground level ozone, nitric acid and organic compounds, volatile organic compounds. So, this is correct. Then, photochemical smog occurs in a cool, humid and dusky climate. Incorrect. Why? Because for the formation of this smog, you do require sunlight to be present. So, sunlight is very, very important. So, the second statement is going to be incorrect. Now, I know that 2 is incorrect. Wherever I have 2 which is present, eliminate that. I know 1 is correct. So, automatically that leaves me with 1 option only. But anyways, plants like Quercus and Pyrus help in controlling photochemical smog. They do by absorbing the oxygen, the excessive oxygen compounds, oxygen ions, and also the volatile organic compounds, they are also absorbed there. So that is why certain plants, they do help in treating or giving a kind of a remedy to photochemical smog. You also have specialized paints made up of titanium dioxide and so on, which is put on pavements, which is put on roads in order to have increased absorption of this photochemical smog. So this is correct. So you have D, that is 1 and 3, which are correct. Okay? Now, consider the following statements regarding aquatic ecosystem. So when we talk about aquatic ecosystem, we have the lotic and the lentic ecosystem. One signifies a moving one, that you consider that of a river or a stream, all those. And the others that you have, they generally end up indicating a kind of a smaller lake or ponds that you have, small accumulation of water. There also you have a kind of a smaller aquatic ecosystem. Okay? So, lentic ecosystems can be saline or freshwater ecosystem, but lotic water ecosystems are always freshwater ecosystem. This is incorrect. Why? Because both lentic and lotic ecosystems, they are going to be freshwater ecosystems. Okay? None of them are going to be saline ecosystem. Both of them are going to be freshwater ecosystem. Then, lentic ecosystems are marshy or swampy areas with wide diversity of plants and animals. Incorrect. Marshy and swampy areas, generally, they are considered to be wetland ecosystem. Right? Here, we consider lakes, small ponds, right? These are considered to be those freshwater ecosystems. Now, again, we have to find out which of them are incorrect. We know that 1 and 2 is incorrect. There is only one option which satisfies that. But anyways, lotic ecosystems include rapidly flowing and still water habitats with comparatively low diversity of plants and animals. Now here, look at it carefully. Include rapidly flowing and still water habitats. How can a low-tech ecosystem include both of them? Right? The other one is basically that of a lentic ecosystem. So here, this is again incorrect. Right? While low-tech ecosystem does represent streams and rivers which are flowing, lentic ecosystem represents the static ones, the static fresh water, the ponds and the lakes which have significant depth in certain cases. Those are the lentic ecosystems. Okay? So the third statement is also incorrect. We have to find out the incorrect one. The answer will be D, that is 1, 2 and 3. All of them or both of them are rather aquatic ecosystems. Okay? Now, which of the following is or are correct with reference to the invasive alien species? So, invasive alien species, the species which have come on and which have started thriving in an area where they do not belong originally or naturally. So, invasive alien species, first of all, in the short run, it increases the species richness. So, when suppose in any area you suddenly have large number of species which start coming in, then obviously automatically in the smaller run that will lead to more species in existence, more richer biodiversity. So, that is why this is correct. However, in the long run, that invasive alien species will then outgrow and outstruggle each and every existing one, and that invasive one will be the species which shall dominate that ecosystem. So that is why it is invasive. Then it increases mutualism among native and alien species. This is incorrect. Why? Mutualism is what? Where both of them can benefit. It increases competition generally. It does not promote mutualism. So the second one is incorrect. Third, islands are more vulnerable to invasive alien species. This is actually correct. Why? Because in the case of islands, there you did not have or you do not have the scope where enough competition has been in existence. So many of the ecosystems, they do not have an ample utilization of space, they do not have the ample or the survivable species in existence. So any time when an alien invasive species comes in, thereby those species, for example eucalyptus, for example you have certain species of snakes, the pythons that you have, all of them when they are reintroduced or introduced in those areas, they can very quickly increase in number because they very quickly form themselves to be the climax species or apex predators and they start thriving. So islands, they are basically more vulnerable to invasive alien species. So you have 1 and 3 which is going to be correct in this case and 2 is going to be incorrect. Okay? So that is where we will restrict the discussion for today. Today we have looked at many of the questions ranging from the topics and from the issues of biodiversity to ecosystems, to ecotone, to niches, to basically mangroves, then also wetlands and so on. Tomorrow when we meet again, tomorrow we shall be talking about the species, the endangered species, the protected areas in news and few of the topics or a couple of topics regarding hydrogen, green hydrogen, grey hydrogen, which is very, very important for this particular year. So hope that this discussion was useful for you and you extracted something out of it which either you did not know from before or has helped you in revising that. If you did like the video, then please click on the like and subscribe and also click on the bell icon so that you receive the notification. We meet again for those species portion. Till then, goodbye and thank you.